Good. So I started recording. So again, I'll be brief. So my name is Mike Cardus. I run a small boutique organization development company out of Buffalo, New York in the US. So I do organization development, which tends to look at organizations in the whole from the outside in and try to understand how we use mixtures of sort of management science and behavioral science to improve organizations and to also improve how people work inside those groups. She'd reached out to me a while ago and asked me about giving a talk to this agile group. So I'll be open with you guys. Like I know a little bit about agile, but I'm not really like an agile practitioner. So please, if I use things wrong, like be polite and sort of you can yell at me and throw agile spears at me if you like, but I'm going to sort of do my best and make it fit. So today, you know, a couple of things about my background. Like number one, so I started my career as being an environmental scientist. So I actually went to Clemson University in South Carolina, and I got a master's in entomology, studying insects. So I'm a huge fan of bugs and science and nature. But eventually, I went on to get an MBA while I was at Clemson. Then I went on to run, be the manager of their org development and internal talent development pieces in Clemson University. Then I worked with a place that ended up in Buffalo. So you know, today I'm going to talk about the cynefin framework. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. We have some folks who may be more familiar than others. That's okay. Again, we'll have a discussion about this. We'll see how it goes. I'll cover sort of the broad area. And then one thing I'll cover on the back end is I'll share some examples of how I'm utilizing it with organizations and teams. So it's good to kind of show how we're using mural and virtual pieces and things to kind of tie it all together and then show you some concrete examples of how we're utilizing it. Is that all right? Also, you know, any questions or any feedback, we'll have some pause points. You can sort of have some interaction pieces. You know, I'm not going to have any breakout rooms. It's a small group. So I thought we'll kind of just roll through it. But if you want to add something or say something, you know, it's a small group. So feel free to unmute yourself. So say, hey, Mike, I want to add something, and that's really okay. All right? So again, today, two main objectives. Number one, walk through the cynefin framework, talk a bit about it. Number two is going to be to kind of have a little discussion about it, show you some examples, and then talk about how we're using it. All right? So
Mike,
yes.
We are somewhat familiar. Some of us are familiar with cynefin. We had training delivered in the Vancouver office, right? And Aaron also asked that when we're going to cover this. So we keep on asking people like what topics you would want to have to discuss. So I think there is some level, varying level of familiarity with it.
Yeah, I'll spend like 10 minutes and kind of go over the basics, right? I mean, because it's an easy framework to get. And then from that, we can have a richer discussion about utilizing it. Okay? And so quick background. So I first came across the cynefin framework maybe in 2010 or so. And at that time, I was rolling out some large scale organization development projects with a large manufacturing client and with several healthcare clients, and also doing some work out of Kuwait with telecommunications. And it's a helpful framework to begin to kind of see and identify how things are working in the organization. So let me kick into this. And I'll kind of go through the beginning couple pieces. And so in this, the one thing I thought about, and we use this process, is early on, and this is going to be some early COVID discussion and late COVID discussion, but one thing that we kept seeing, and in a really nice way, COVID became a really good experience in identifying complexity and change and how things sort of fit in the organizations and ways to kind of begin to make sense of what's going on. So what we kept seeing with clients is that there's this whole feeling that everything is kind of falling apart, that there's a challenge, and we kept telling folks, well, there are some things you're currently doing that are actually relatively effective and they can make sense. And so we kept sort of saying, how can you learn from this chaos and complexity around you? And from the learning environment, be able to kind of see things that are slightly complex, I'll work that in a second, and make some order around that. That also sort of when everything's changing around you and you haven't experienced it before, how do you lead or plan in that environment? So it's almost like when we were talking earlier about the kitchens or the restaurants, suddenly you're dropped in this total sort of tornado of chaos and things are spinning around you. How do you as a leader or an individual begin to make sense of that and kind of see how things go? And the last part is thinking about this is as you begin to use the Cynefin framework and make sense of things, how do you start to support your teams to see what's going on and create some solid process behind this? And one thing about I'm pretty open with is that I'm very biased towards teamwork and team groups. This I think is a great quote that comes from Sonia Blignot, Sonia and Michael Chevrolet, and those guys are all very involved in the Cynefin Center. So it's hard to survive in the jungle if you were trained in the zoo. And this is in some ways looking at if we have an existing long-term frame or a group or an organization that's used to stable environments, a set organization, things are kind of set, it's kind of traveling along. Once the environment around you changes and shifts, it's a much harder way to kind of understand things. And so I think about right now, several of my clients who are in food service and also several of my clients who are in manufacturing. And in food service and manufacturing prior to COVID, they had stable incomes, right? 2019, 2020 was a very good year for a lot of folks in the US. Things were moving pretty well. All of a sudden COVID hits and that sort of consistent idea of like the money being there and the work being there got squeezed. So suddenly we were dropped into the jungle. And with this analogy being the jungle is suddenly you have to redevelop ways you go about things. You got to create new tests. You got to shift your frameworks. You have to do all those sort of cliche things in complexity that we talk about. So a lot of this is sort of saying, if you're currently inside the zoo or you're having a hard time, how do you begin to make sense of this? And so I'm going to stop my share. So now I'm going to drop into a different screen. I'm going to go into Mural. Sorry guys, give me a second. I'm going to go into this Mural. And now I'm going to go walk through the Cynefin framework. So background about Cynefin. Those of you who know about it, you know about it. Those who don't know, I'll kind of walk through the process. So Cynefin itself is a Welsh word. A gentleman named Dave Snowden developed it. Dave was very involved in knowledge management. I worked at IBM. Eventually, he sort of left IBM, created Cognitive Edge, made the Cynefin framework. I've done several projects with them, utilizing SenseMaker and rolling out ways to kind of capture and use Cynefin across organizations. So it's a fun framework. I use it in various ways, organizations, but one thing that I'm big on, and this is sort of me being facilitator, Mike, is very rarely do I call it the Cynefin framework. When I'm working with an organization, much like when I was doing a lot of lean projects or Six Sigma projects, I never actually called it that. We just utilize it in the format to make it fit. So I'm going to walk through this piece. Cynefin itself has what we call 5 domains. We're big on sort of saying this is not a 2x2 matrix. It's almost seen as if it's a sort of topographical map or a way to make sense of your environment. So when you're thinking about it and I describe it, it's always from the framework of the decision maker or the person that has to decide and then making sense of their environment and then determining what is the best option inside their challenge to move forward and getting things done. So consistently think about it from the frame of the decision maker, or if we're using, I'm doing some work now inside a bank and we're looking at customer maps or journey mapping. So normally we say based upon the customer or where they are in the journey, how are they going to react to the environments? So we have these separate domains. And the one thing to be thoughtful of is there's essentially 2 different areas that we talk about. One is what we call ordered environments. And by order, we mean things that have sufficient cause and effect, or there's existing best cases or best practices for those parts. And then on the other end, we have what's called unordered. And unordered are where we get into the complex areas or the parts that we say we can't directly determine cause and effect in the process. So I'm going to walk through this quickly, kind of give you some areas. Let me just drop a box in here. So here, and those of you who, I don't know if you know the version, but the Cynefin went through an update recently, so they changed the language around a little bit. This domain here is now being called clear. And clear essentially means that you can understand it, you have the existing knowledge and resources, and things make sense. And in the clear, this is where we know that we have our sort of, I like to say, clear, CL. This is where we know that we have our So here we have what are called like our known, right? Knowns. So even inside here is when we have sufficient knowledge and information to make sense of things. We know what's going to happen. We understand the environment, and we have sufficient people to kind of make progress or success on this. And inside here, there's essentially 3 different ways we go about things, right? So we do what's called you sense. So you work to understand the environment. You categorize, and then you respond. So simple enough. Here, we know what's going on. We can pull a group of folks together. We can make sense of the environment. We sense, categorize, we respond. So for example, here, this would be like your existing team as a challenge. They're trying to get things done. You pull them together. You ask them a question. All the known knowns are there. You can make sense. Additionally, here, we also have, we also call best practices. So here we have experts and we have best practices to kind of get things done. Relatively clear, we can create cause and effect. Moving up to this piece, this is what we would call complicated. Complicated. So here, this is what we call a domain of experts. So up here in the complicated domain, this is when, for example, your existing team doesn't have knowledge or information to figure things out, and they have to be thoughtful about what they're doing. And so in here, we're saying that the existing team members don't have sufficient knowledge to figure things out, and they need an expert. So someone like an agile coach, a sort of business case, a lawyer kind of comes and helps out with the team. So in here, we're trying to say is these are the known unknowns. So for example, like you know what you don't know, and you got to figure out the knowledge. This way, we normally say these are the domain of experts. So here in this area, we sense, so we try to figure out what we don't know. We analyze, so we break down the parts to figure out the constituent pieces that are currently there. We try to identify what are the parts, how do they fit together, and then here we respond. So in this part, we consistently say that here you have what's called good practices. Good practices. And the difference between clear and complicated normally is a matter of trying to figure out what the level of expertise is needed. So I'll give you an example. So when I was here working a couple of years ago, my mother passed away and I inherited her estate. And I found out from the IRS that her estate was rather deep in sort of back liens and taxes, and I freaked out. So I didn't know where to go. I had to find somebody out. So quickly I contacted a lawyer, because to a lawyer, the challenge was relatively complicated. So I was stuck in the information, couldn't figure it out. I contacted the lawyer. The lawyer helped me figure out how to get things done. And so the lawyer picked up in the process, helped me solve it, and their expertise came through. So in both these areas, we have what are called ordered domains. And over here, let me change the color. So here, this will begin the unordered. So this is where things get a little more challenging. I'll give examples in a second. And here in this domain, we have what's called complex. And in complex, this is when we have multiple challenges and we essentially can't figure out the outcome at a time based upon the challenges at hand. So the complexity means we can't figure out cause and effect, or we're challenging with that, we're stuck, and we have to begin to identify what to do here. So under cause and effect, we do something a little different. We say we pulse, we sense, we respond. And by pulse, what we mean is we run multiple what are called safe to fail experiments. Now, one thing that I've seen when I worked with a lot of Six Sigma groups and lean groups is that they want to run one design of experiment at a time. We say about in a complex environment is where we don't really know what's going to happen. So when you think about complexity, these are things like developing new teams, rolling out culture pieces, leadership stuff, identifying new products that are out there that can get stuck. So in here, we're going to run multiple safe to fail experiments at essentially the same time. We're going to learn from those experiments that are out there. We're going to capture feedback and ideas, and we're going to respond while we're learning. So if you think about it, complex is saying we don't know the cause and the effect. There currently is no existing expert to get things done, and we have to figure it out. Here we have what's called emergent practices or emergent solutions. So here, we don't know the outcomes or the solutions, but ultimately we are looking for them as they kind of come up. So if you think about the complex pieces as saying that we don't currently know, as opposed to the complicated or clear domains, we don't know the outcomes, And what we're planning on doing is running multiple safe to fail experiments to figure out what things do we see as we move. So as we're progressing through the environment, we pick up on different cues. Here in this lower domain, we have what's called chaos. And chaos is that like when things all of a sudden blow up, so things are falling apart. So in chaos, we act rapidly. We sense what's going on from the action, and we respond to what we're sensing. So here, these are those like cliche active shooter experiments, but also we saw a good experiment in chaos was when COVID-19 first hit, and a lot of groups were thrown into this chaos environment and they didn't currently know how to act. So they quickly had to figure out, we need to get IT teams, we need to get our laptops out there, we have to get everybody put together. And here we have what's called novel solutions. So simple enough, these are the frameworks. And then in the center now, a different color. In the center of the cynefin, it used to be called disorder. It's now just called confused. To make that larger. Make this bigger. It's now called confused. So it's now called confused. And by confused, what we mean again is that you currently aren't too sure which one of the domains you are in, and you need to figure out kind of how to act in those pieces. So overall, the framework in the cynefin is sort of saying in some ways, here are the 5 domains. So clear eventually is like your known knowns. You know what's going on. You pull a team together. You can get the feedback, and you can then be able to identify what's working, put into place best practices. So again, the example here I think about is a lot of like creative problem solving models. A lot of times when you pull your team together, they have the knowledge, they have the experience, they have the ideas. Now you're just trying to get them to figure out how to put it into place. And then over here at the top, we have complicated, that's your domain of experts. So think about inside like a manufacturing plant would be an example of this. Like you have expertise, you have toolers, you have agile coaches, you have folks who have knowledge, they get things done. In this area, we have what's called complex, right? So complex zones, we're trying to create multiple safe-to-fail experiments, but ultimately in complexity, you don't know what's gonna happen. And then we have the chaos, which is this piece here. So I'm gonna keep this up, but I'm gonna also say, you know, that's the overall framework. And in the middle is confused. One thing to be thoughtful of, and we see this a lot, I'll get to here when I show you the examples, is there's also, we want to see a movement inside the domains. So I'll use COVID-19 as an example. I'm going to show you an example how we use it later on. It's suddenly like COVID-19 hits and we've held to a chaos process. In chaos, there is quick need to act and respond, stabilize the troops, get folks home, get PPE out, roll those kind of things. And while we're doing that, we pull the team into complexity because you want to get out of chaos as soon as possible. The longer you stay in chaos, the more challenging it's going to be and the more you're going to fall apart. So you want to be able to kind of pull yourself out of chaos, and chaos normally is the only time that there has to be strong directorial leadership, meaning let's move guys, get to the outcomes, figure things out, because you want to try to get in the complex zone as soon as possible when you're in chaos. Because in complexity, you're rolling out multiple safe to fail experiments across the organization to see how things pan out. And then from that, you can begin to kind of stabilize things. And as you're rolling things from complexity, you begin to kind of understand the system. And the complex stuff then becomes kind of complicated. So think about like any change management process. We're bringing a change in the organization, implementing a new IT system. We don't know what's going to happen. We roll it out to the users. We capture some user feedback in real time. And from our multiple A/B or experiments that you're doing there, you're capturing multiple user feedback. We're understanding the process. As we gather multiple user feedback, we can then make it complicated because now we know the system. We now know how their users are going to respond back to the technology or the change process. And as we stabilize that, then it becomes sort of known knowns in the system. So there's always movement inside the cynefin, and there's always an idea of sort of flow or movement inside the domains. So that's kind of the quick sort of nutshell of the cynefin. I'm going to stop the share and ask this. So 2 things. Number 1, does anybody want to add anything that maybe sort of like they think I missed, or are there any questions that are kind of hanging out there? I'm just going to, if you want to speak, go ahead and unmute yourself if you want to speak. I can open my window.
So Mike, we are, my group I work with, right? We are like, we are part of the innovation team, and we were not using customer journey maps, and we are going to start using them. So maybe one of the examples you can show us, like how did you use Cynefin when you said that to see how customer will react to the environment. If you can give a little bit more detail afterwards, even.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, yeah. Sorry, Krishi.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll show that in a second. I mean, I think I kind of give a quick breeze through it because I think the model set was helpful. And the one thing to be thoughtful of, again, is this, and we're seeing it a lot out there in the environment, is where do I currently stand? And so I'll
Mhm.
use an example. So like, I was working with a group. Well, let me pull up the examples. Let me pull up an example for you guys. So that's helpful. And then we can sort of chat more about this. Share screen. Do this
And I
here.
think Dave has again changed the middle domain. He's calling in something else now, operatic or something.
Yeah, so there's I don't want to get too confusing or use too many sort of inside
Yeah.
words. So there's also the liminal cynefin, which has a liminal overlap here.
Yeah.
And then
Mhm.
the confused can be confused slash apparatic. Apparatic is a Derrida term, philosopher Derrida, talking about you don't know the decision. If you knew all the outcomes of the decision you were going to make, it's not actually a decision, it's a calculation. And so in the confused domain, we're using the term confused just to keep it simpler for people with language.
Mhm.
Um, as you guys know, Dave Snowden is quite a philosopher in his words. And so apparatic essentially just means that at this point, we don't really know. And there's even a deeper level of cynefin, there's like 4 or 5 ways that when you're stuck and confused, how to identify which of the domains or categories you might be in, which can make things a little more confusing. But and the simplest way to use it, like I'm kind of giving you guys the version here. We can get deeper if you want to, but like we keep saying that ultimately I'm faced with a challenge. With a challenge, the question normally is, what kind of knowledge do I have about that decision or challenge, and how do I act? And you'll see here at the bottom of the cynefin, there's this little fold. It's meant to be sort of 3-dimensional. And the one thing that I absolutely love, and we see this, we saw it with COVID, we saw it with companies, larger companies like Kodak and other kind of companies, that if you continue to behave or act as if everything is clear or it's a stable environment, and you create your entire organization around that stability of the environment, so you act as if your customers are going to always be your customers. You behave as if the environment is never going to shift around you. Eventually, you fall off this thing that, if I can get my drawing out here, you fall off this thing. You fall here. We call it the cliff, and when you fall off the cliff, at that point, you're falling that like that oh no moment where suddenly everything falls apart. So you're behaving as if your environment's never going to change, everything is stable, and then if you behave that way, you fall off into this cliff of chaos, and in chaos there has to be a rapid movement to kind of cut people and change things. Which is why we say in organizations sometimes, draw again, we say that if you're a manager or if you're leading things, you want to sometimes create a shallow dive into chaos. So if you feel as if things are getting relatively understandable, or you're not creating enough innovation, or things are getting kind of stuck, you want to create almost a shallow dive into chaos, and then work with the team to kind of then develop the chaos. You want to kind of shake things up, unstabilize the environment, and from that, be able to move them to an emergent process. What I mean by that, again, is you're purposely moving things around, or you're taking away resources or adding resources, and you're forcing them to kind of, again, behave in a complex way where they don't know what's going to happen, but you're observing from the complexity what outcomes are coming out. And from that, you're then kind of almost trying to bring the loop back into here. And there's a lot of recursive loops in here, but it's sort of their way of saying that there's always a process. So what I keep thinking about it, and the language I've been using a lot, is that with groups, and I'll show you an example in 2 seconds, you want to capturing information first. So I'm gonna bounce to a different mural. Can you guys see this distinctive working well small improvements piece? Yes? Okay, good. So with this is, let me show you just an example. I'll show you 2 examples. This one is a little different. So I was working with a nonprofit. They're around they're an NGO around $10 million. And COVID first hit, and I can send you a larger slide of this. And we were trying to figure out how to make sense of the company going forward. So the company hit, there was a large shock to the system. We used COVID. Additionally, this organization though was rather stagnant for years. They had good income coming in, stable clients. So I'm working with them now through developing new processes and systems. So I did this thing called distinctive working well small improvements. So I had 5 managers. I asked each of the 5 managers to spend 2 weeks and every day simply write down what's distinctive about the work that they did, what was distinctive or different about that day, what was working relatively well about their day, what things can we improve. So in some ways, this is like a start, stop, continue. I'm sure many of you have your own tools and how do we do these sort of things. Plus, minus, delta. It's a similar process. But I wanted them to get used to making sense of their environments because they weren't, as they were going through their day, they weren't being reflective on kind of what their environment was happening. And we weren't able to capture what we call signals or trends to look at patterns for change. Because again, they were so buried in their work, they couldn't figure out trends. And that's one thing that I think, cynefin, and also what you do in your agile work, you try to get folks to look at trends or sort of signifiers that help them figure out, oh, here's where we want to go. Here's a pattern trend, whether it be good or bad. So I'm not going to bore you with all these details. We went into the distinctive working well small improvements. I had them actually do all this process. Here's all their outcomes. We put all these on this distinctive working well small improvement chart. So then we went through all these small improvements. And I asked them under small improvements, you see they put things down like, implement your guest strategies and take more tasks. I had them in a small improvements begin to kind of develop categories. So one thing that we say in cynefin is why I showed you the framework, the clear, complicated, complex, chaos, and the confused. Before you have people start to think about the task they're doing, so that journey mapping, for example, before folks think about the task they're doing, you want them to get the data first. So we say a lot of times data before categorization. Because if you say folks, hey, we're going to do a project, hey, why don't you write down projects that are complex in a complex domain and things that are clear in a clear domain, they're going to make the work match those domains as opposed to capturing customer feedback, or this will also be like a journey map or like a capturing management feedback, and having the data first. And then I had them take this data, let me show you the example, and we actually took the data and then placed the data here on the cynefin. And so this is a way that actually worked really well. And so what we did, we went through all the data sets. I took all these small improvements with the team. We gathered the small improvements first. And then from those, I kind of said, all right, so of these small improvements, which ones do you think are that we can do relatively immediately? So we kind of said, these are tasks we want to complete, right? And those be clear. So in the immediate pieces, they said, okay, we can do these things relatively quickly. So immediate means we have the skills and knowledge. We don't need more resources, and people can do it relatively quickly without any extra efforts, right? So we added these pieces in, and you see things like visual meetings, hire more people, these board pieces. I'm going to show you a different example too. But again, to help them begin to say, okay, and then from this piece, from the best practices, we were then able to assign the tasks to staff to get done, create a standard project charter or project document, and then move forward on this. But we knew there wasn't any more need for resources. Then I said, let's walk through our good practices. Out of these things, what needs small budget and what expertise do we need? So for example, this group, because their level of IT knowledge is relatively low, right? They had to look at ways to kind of figure out new IT systems. They had to bring out ideas and kind of looking at steps and other orgs are doing to improve or make improvements to their process. These were things that they needed an expert or somebody from the outside to give them feedback on. And there were ideas they had to think about and then be able to kind of look at the process. So this meant, again, is they needed outside expertise. They couldn't do it themselves. And we were able to kind of categorize this. And then we were able to, for most of these projects, get a small little budget, like $500 to $1,000 per project or less, to then kind of capture the expertise, get feedback, and then have various experts present to the group on how to do things. So think about even like your meetup groups, for example. Like in your meetup groups, a lot of what you're dealing with is kind of complicated and complex challenges. So you get folks like me, other folks from other disciplines, to share ideas with you guys to improve your workplace. In the complex domain, these are things that, again, were sort of emergent. And in most organizations with this guys, this was more like culture and hybrid team pieces. So here I kind of said, what things are currently complex, meaning we don't have a clear understanding what's going to happen. How do we do this? And they kind of put these ideas here. And then from here, from these areas, we actually pulled, I think, 4 or 5 of these. And we said, okay, so what rapid small experiments can we currently do inside the organization to figure out what we can learn from this? So communication, I mean, we did this piece here, lack of assurance and staff feels in regard to their health and those around them. Some departments remain entrenched in old-style communication. So these were things where we had to run multiple experiments. So Khurshid, I use an example because I'm working out at the bank. So with their journey mapping, what they're doing is under complex. These are where the bank currently is actually changing the user's experience when they get to the bank. So they have tellers changing the greetings. They're also in real time changing like fees or fees or sort of charges under things. And they're creating these large databases inside the bank of small tests. They call them A/B testing, but there's like 13 different tests going on at one time on user groups. And from those 13 different complex tests on user groups, they're identifying in the trends what's creating positive engagement with the bank, what's creating negative engagement with the bank. With the complex, it's the same example I think about, like, I'm sure you guys know what Facebook is, but at some point I read an article and they said that there isn't one Facebook. There's almost 15 to 16,000 different Facebook versions working in real time consistently to figure out what's best to maximize you as a consumer. So that's a different way. And then under chaos, novel practice, how will we act when this happens? This is that like, oh shit, the world's falling apart piece. And we kind of said, hey, so if the second wave kind of comes in, how do we prepare more for this? And so you can see how we kind of capture the data from this. We had them begin to kind of almost simple enough kind of say, all right, so in small groups for the next 2 weeks, just document this. What was distinctive about your experience? What stood out was unique to you? What worked well? What can we do to make things better? And from this piece, the team then developed this cynefin frame. And from the cynefin frame, we were then able to best identify how to go about supporting the projects moving forward. I feel like I threw a whole lot at you guys there, but I'm going to show you just one more example, and then we'll kind of have a little discussion. Let me just go back to my dashboard. Here's another example we used with cynefin. This one, again, used a different tool. I'm sorry to throw a tool to you guys, but I want to kind of show you the end piece. So this was something we did with an telecom service. I had 5 of their directors on the call, and we did this sort of present, past, future process based on working from home. And you'll see in the system we had, today was like right now, past was pre-COVID, future is post-COVID, to work out how we're gonna do systems. And we went through sort of the ecosystem, and what ecosystem is the larger environment impacting us. And then this is how people at work learn from work at home, how they use work at home, how they remember work at home. And the potential was amongst their existing opportunities, how can they make sense of things, market potential? And they did the same thing in the future. So I had them actually run through a frame to kind of gather some data on current skills, past skills, future skills. And then let's do the same thing here. So here, you'll see we captured all the market viability pieces. So again, I'm thinking about if you're running I'm going to assume you're running an agile team, and you're capturing sort of patterns of things that are working, or you're figuring out with your IT teams or your user teams, what sort of things they want to see or outcome measurements. We can begin to map these. So with this, we grab the team, we kind of say, okay, so what's relatively clear? What can we do immediately based upon these pieces, right? And they put these parts here. From these, we assigned people to work on these areas or kind of focus on these. Complicated, again, the team itself needed outside expertise, meaning it did not have the inside expertise to make sense of this and had to understand pieces. So they mapped things here. This one's kind of on the edge. Additionally, here's the complex stuff, right? So they were trying to say, we already created 4 new products. Do we have to create a new product development team for our organization? We did lose some people and we're concerned about back to work. Will we rehire people? thoughts of acquisition, make more opportunities for movement and advancements. With a more robust IT system based upon work from home, can we create consulting for our consulting and hire internal operation people? This one was kind of between confused in these areas. We were capturing employee experience data. So we're currently inside the organization capturing how employees experience the workplace and seeing how we can improve retention and recruitment in the organization. Chaos was, prior to COVID, we had a talent shortage, how that continue. So the two examples, it was a way to kind of say, we captured some sort of data, and the data was user generated, or even sort of, you can kind of take more non-user generated data and feed it back. And then from that, begin to say, what can we do immediately? No cost, low cost. We had internal expertise. Do we need outside help? What expertise do we need? What's currently complex? Have we run multiple state-to-fill experiments? And what is kind of chaotic in the process? So, I mean, I sort of wanted to give you guys a quick thumbnail. We can kind of come back to that. But so let me sort of pause here. I feel like through a lot of you guys in different ways. So what questions are burning, or what feedback, or kind of how can I make things clearer for you?
I thought Wayne had a big smile on there, so he must be pretty happy.
And if you want to tell me, so the one big thing that we're saying, this is one thing to be thoughtful of, is in my mind, I'm consistently saying to groups, this is me as a consultant. I want to be careful to not impose to the group I'm working with my expertise on them. I want them to be able to identify, based upon the data they're gathering, what are some ways for them to kind of go about solving those problems and then best approach those problems? Because the one thing is this: if we go into a complex challenge, let's use something like a complex challenge might be, let's say, for example, like so you want to reduce turnover of staff that are 35 and younger, and we're doing this right now inside of another large bank. The bank has a huge turnover of staff that are 35 and younger. If I come in and say, it's a relatively simple process, just follow these sort of 5 steps as a complicated experts, the reality is those steps may not work. So we have to figure out ways that inside that environment, it's a bank, it's a government operation, there's a lot of variabilities that I don't know anything about. So when I'm consulting them, I have to be careful to kind of say, I'm the expert about consulting processes. You guys are the experts in agile frameworks, Kanban, all those kind of things. But you may not know the intricacies of the people you're working with. So the staff under 35. So what we did with that group is I said, instead of me telling you how to reduce turnover of staff under 35, let's take a second, let's capture some pattern data. What are keeping folks under 35 inside your organization? What's scaring them away? From the things that are keeping folks inside your organization, now we're moving into the complex domain. We say, how can we create more stories like these, folks that want to stay, less stories like these, folks that are leaving? And the more stories like these, less stories like these, we then create a series of small experiments. And the experiments were actually done, because it's a large enough organization, separately. So we had 5 different experiments happening at the same time. And we kept the small teams, or teams of 3, separate from each other. And they all tried to tackle the turnover piece in a different way. And the idea behind the complex process was, by them trying to tackle it in different ways, we knew they weren't all going to succeed. There'd be some variability there. We wanted to capture, while they were going about the process, what was working. And as they reported back to the leadership team, we were able to capture feedback and more patterns and then make it complicated. Meaning at the end of the process, we put 4 or 5 mandates in place. Mandate 1 is increase the number of projects, high profile projects, being led by staff that are 35 and younger. Because we realized the staff were leaving because they weren't getting high profile projects. Why? Because tenured long-term staff got all the fancy projects and young folks didn't get anything. So at the end we said, hey, we found out that's what they want. So we increased the number of high profile projects to like 78%. right? Number two, before you have senior team meetings, have people brainstorm prior to the meeting and then either email the information to the senior team member or bring their brainstorm sheets to the meeting already completed. Why? Because in that culture, if you're a junior team member, your ideas don't mean anything because you're not the senior banker, right? They think you're some dumb kid. So that shuts down feedback. And so we said, hey, number two is all brainstorming is done prior to meetings at the desk before they come to the group. And the third part was every project team going forward had to have at least one staff member under 35. So we came into an organization, high turnover, 78% staff there are 35 and younger. After 3 years, now it's like 22% of staff there are 35 and younger leave. But I had to be careful to sort of say, instead of doing these 5 locked in steps I know work, they may not work in your environment. Let's try a complex experiment, capturing some feedback, and then feed that into complicated. As it became complicated, we then made it clear because now we know it works inside that environment. Does that make sense in some way? Sorry, wait, I think you were going to say something, but I went into a tirade about complexity and experiments, so.
No, I don't know. I was just going to comment. There's a lot of information you've given us, and I'm trying to process it, and I think I'm in the complex or maybe even chaotic zone right now in my brain.
That's one of, yeah, I know I'm guilty of that, so.
No. It's not, like you say, it's a lot of tools and a lot of different approaches to help in different situations. And it's got the wheel spinning about, well, what would I use and where and what kind of situations am I dealing with? How can I pull something out of this? And I'm seeing a lot of things and maybe almost too many, but.
Yeah, another way to think about it, again, is saying, is if you're currently faced with a challenge you have to work through, right? It's stopping and saying, okay, I'm currently kind of confused about this. How do I handle this? And I think about, like, I don't know about you guys, but I know like sometimes companies will call in an expert, a consultant, to fix something. Because, hey, this thing is broken, Mike. Can you fix our broken culture in our organization? And just give us our simple 3-step solution. Give me your expert feedback on what we ought to do, right? And then tell me how to fix this thing. And the hard part is sometimes you have to explain to the clients that that's not going to best get things done. So you have to frame it to the client in a way to sort of say, I am not sure the best way to do this, but what we have to do first is kind of move into the complex domain. And here's an example of complexity. And from what I've seen, most executives and most business and even most adults know about complexity relatively well, and they kind of get it. And you say, we have to kind of go out there and actually run some small experiments, and we can do it pretty low key, right? We can just do a simple, like that working well distinctive feedback piece, do some survey data, get some feedback. And then from that, I can come back to you, Mr. Executive Team, and say, hey, here's some data, here's some feedback to kind of get things done. Because if I treat a complex problem, if I treat a group of people who are complex as if they're complicated, they get very angry with me, right? People want to think that they have their ideas and they have their beliefs and they have their intuition, but to go in and say, oh, you want to change management program? It's really easy. Follow these 7 steps and voila, you got a magic change. So the cynefin framework, whether you call it that or not.
Did someone go on mute?
I just muted Brad. So help to, it's okay. So help to, with a team, then to create some common language around things. And I would think about with your agile groups, with agile teams, if you're with like a business unit to kind of say, hey, these pieces here in our small experiments, these are pretty clear, right? Low key, easy wins, not much effort. We can run some sort of quick, agile cycles on these, get those done. These pieces here, we need some more expert feedback. So we need to have some experts kind of come in. We need to have the business unit team here. We need the IT experts. We need some process. We'll call the experts, get feedback, make a choice. The complex ones, well, the reality is let's run a series of A/B experiments across the organization on these things. Again, I think about even my email blasts, for example. Like my email blasts have multiple taglines. I can create different email systems. I can change where my links are. And from those, I'm capturing feedback to sort of say what creates the most click-throughs. right? What gets the most links on those pieces? How those things work? Those are complex experiments. As I capture enough data around those, they then become complicated because that become part of my expertise, my process. And the chaos stuff, I mean, that's almost, so like if you talk to Michael Chevrolet and those guys, there's also a big team, there's a lot now like red teaming, right? So the whole red teaming movement and the OODA loops, all that stuff's kind of coming out now. But red teaming is sort of saying, okay, let's say we have our business strategy in place. What if our competitor gets a hold of the business strategy? How will they beat us with this? And that's sort of chaos planning. It's sort of saying, if suddenly we lose a large client, or if suddenly our competitor takes over all this foothold from us, how are we going to respond to that? What are all the gaps inside that piece? If suddenly like an Amazon comes and buys up our entire feedback system, what are we going to do with that? And that's a way to kind of say, what are our chaos systems?
So Mike, do you get a lot of pushback from companies when you come in and do this sort of thing, or do they seem to accept it fairly well and understand it?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I realized, and this is when I was in my like early 20s, I was working inside a main. When I get my master's in my early 20s, I in some kind of weird way became the Lean Six Sigma quality improvement guy inside manufacturing plants, right? And I realized really quickly, when you call something a quality improvement project, everyone hates it. No one wants to do it. They automatically kind of create a way to kind of fight against it. So instead of calling it those things, the resistance gets decreased when you explain to them, I'm going to work with you guys to get these things before the process. I don't call it anything. I mean, I don't even call it cynefin. I'll just show them, I'll just draw me on the board. Like, what's to be clear and obvious to you? What expert help do we need? What currently do we not know enough about to make sense about? And what's going to happen if things blow up? And then people kind of get those four frames. In the middle, I'll say, and what are you currently confused about? And they'll say, oh. Now, why I said data before categorization, you're involving them in the feedback piece and you're not using fancy words. I realized that with many people, those fancy terms, well, it makes us, me, the academics feel good. So because we can have arguments about aporadic versus confused versus Derrida's concept on sort of this, or we can talk about, things like Piaget's adult learning models versus the lenticle versus the Jacques learning models, which no one really cares about. I tend to avoid those terms. And so generally the pushback isn't that extreme because you're saying, this is your data. I captured it with you. And we use, again, any kind of way you capture it. I mean, this is your feedback I got from the group. This is what you showed me. And you have them kind of self-categorize things. You're putting them in the driver's seats. And one of the big things we're saying in the cynefin groups too is we're saying that, again, you want to remove you as the experts and make sure that they're in the expert role. Now you have expertise, I'm not undermining that, but you're saying that this is your data and feedback. Here's your ideas. That as I'm leading projects, which I do in many organizations, behind the scenes, I'm making sure that we're getting the projects completed, but you keep sort of making sure that you're giving feedback them quickly. So resistance, sometimes I get resistance, but not very often. And again, I work with everywhere from, like I have government contracts, military contracts, all the way to, I'm currently working with 3 like grassroots startups that are all like pre-capital. So, and if there's resistance, maybe I just am too ignorant to notice it. I mean, maybe I just roll right over it. So sometimes. So I guess let me ask. So does anybody here sort of feel that they have enough information to kind of maybe try it out, like, or try out sort of like a project and see if they can sort of cynefin place some things inside there?
I think I'm going to want to rewatch the presentation maybe a couple of times, but the approach I like, gathering the information first and then placing it on the cynefin framework, I think is a good idea.
Yeah, I think from some of the things that Khurshid and I have done in the last 6 months since the pandemic started, especially in the telecom side that you touched on. We did a bit of a clean coffee table experiment with the sales teams, asking them what their opinion was of challenges that their customers had, and then place them into the cynefin framework, just like you had showed there, Mike, which I thought was pretty interesting. And then we said, okay, next steps. Let's think about what we could do to kind of move it forward. And our teams were so focused on kind of the task at hand, they weren't able to step back and look at kind of what was really truly impacting our customers during that transition and look for the opportunities. We had multiple discussions on how we maybe could make a difference as a telco. And we had some success. I don't want to make it sound like it was completely terrible, but your thoughts around capturing the data sets and having the individuals, we did the brainstorming. We said, okay, now step back and let's do your day-to-day and that distinctive, working well, and small improvements. I think that there was an opportunity to use a framework like that. And some of the brainstorm pre-meeting, sometimes we'll do it like a lean coffee table and get everybody start putting stickies up electronically, obviously, because we're working remotely, and maybe not giving them enough time to think about it. Although I think it's a limited number of people that actually think about it before the session, but that might be an opportunity to try something along those lines too. So I thought those were a couple of good takeaways for me, anyways.
The one thing that I like about it, and again, I presented this locally to a lot of sort of like Buffalo, New York itself is a very like lean Six Sigma sort of town,
Sure.
right? So like Buffalo is Rust Belt manufacturing. It runs a lot of the environments here. A lot of the manufacturing plants are very deep in the lean Six Sigma stuff. You can't pull them out of those pieces, which is fine. But I showed them ways to kind of also use cynefin to overlap on some of their lean and their Six Sigma projects. And to say, for example, let's say we had to reduce like machine turnover time, which is a classic manufacturing example. Reality is you can avoid bringing in your tool makers and your ops manager, because you can probably just go to the guys and it's relatively clear, right? The guys on the floor, they know the machines, they can sense what's going on, they can categorize the needs and respond relatively quickly, and they can get that done without much of an effort. Yeah, they didn't do it right. But again, in another example, we say, hey, with the same piece, if we had to figure out how to develop new ways to create a new manufacturing process on the floor, or change our SOPs, or handle currently reducing management turnover. If we had ops manager who ran 3 areas, now they run, if we had an ops manager who ran 1 area, now they're running 2 areas. Well, that's complex, because now we've shifted the workload, and now we have to kind of create new experiments with that manager to see how things are working. So we've used the framework to kind of say, it doesn't matter what your thought is, it's just saying, can we capture some data first, frame it in the cynefin, and then use those cynefin steps to sort of say, all right, so if it's clear, do it. If it's complicated, find the expertise. If it's complex, run multiple sit-to-fail experiments. If it's chaos, how do we make sure we get out of chaos relatively quick and make sense of things? And then there's always that mobility piece. And some people have asked for me to sort of put some resources in the chat. And what I'll also do is I'll send Khurshid a bunch of resources and links that are probably better than how I explained it. You can also research and learn more about it too if you need to, as far as that goes. Any more sort of burning questions? I know it's getting near that. I have time to hang out. I'm just up to you guys.
I'm pretty sure Brad and Aaron would have some. I'm just waiting for them to formalize their thoughts. While we're waiting, Mike, just building on what the other Mike said, resistance. You come in as a consultant, and especially we working in telco engineering sort of expectation, right? They expect us to figure out the problem and fix it, not start us like gathering stories or I mean, even if you want to do that, they'll say, you gather the stories instead of our stuff. like, so all that Cynefin stuff about self ethnography comes in, right? So how do you, and is it like in your experience different between for-profit and non-profit?
Both. So I have, I've rather broad experience in both those areas.
Mm-hmm.
And so are you asking about, so
So
typically
where do you face the resistance more? When they for a profit organization
Oh.
brings you in and say, you're the expert, figure it out, fix it.
Oh, well, for-profit always, not, the for-profits always want a relatively clear, clean expert to solve things for them.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Nonprofits that are involved with humans and human interaction, they know that things aren't that clear cut and it's way messier. So like if I go into a drug and alcohol program, like to them, they deal with complexity every single day, right? So it's like they're dealing with people and emotions and things. Where if I go into my, I work too with a large manufacturing plant out of Baltimore, right? And they literally expect me to walk in and sort of say, look, Mike, here's our safety issue. How do we fix this? And I go, I'm not your safety guy. I said, let's get your safety team together. Let's work through some process and figure it out. So yeah, Krishi, the pushback normally is in the for-profits. But I do wonder, I guess I'll ask you guys, even inside those examples and those telcos, like, what are some ways that things are complex, you don't currently know the outcomes? What are some ways you could design or develop multiple small experiments to kind of get more data to figure out what is currently working, like what's trending up, what's trending down?
I think my experience has been working with engineers in a telecommunications company. They are totally fine with running experiments. They bring equipment in, they put it in the lab, they try it out, figure out how it works. And so they don't have a problem with that. But as you go up the management tree or the management pyramid, you get more and more resistance to running experiments. So they figure, well, figure out how to do it. Don't run an experiment. Just figure out how to do it and make it work. And so at the engineering level, I don't have any problem at all with experimenting.
Yeah, I agree. Engineers are used to doing things out, running analysis, figuring out multiple failure points. And then as it does go up, okay, some of those, a whole bunch of resources. Thanks, Brad. Those are great. So, and as it does go up and you get to the leadership team, though, you're right, Michael, the challenge then is sort of saying, how do you, what they want to see normally is that sort of macro data. Like, so reality is we ran our experiments, here's the feedback, here's the trend analysis we saw, here's the things we want to sort of see. So the expectation normally is going to be, at that point, you've done your, I'll say sort of quote unquote field work, and you're coming to them sort of saying, all right, based upon our thing, here are 3 options that we know are relatively useful. Now you're playing the experts, right? So in my mind, like Michael, you as the engineering director or team have done your experiments. You've captured some useful feedback in the process. Now you shifted from complex to almost complicated. So you're going to the leadership team and saying, I ran my experiments. Here are 3 different options. Here's the pros and cons on option 1, option 2, option 3. Here's the budget. Here's the outcomes. Here's the process. And then giving them feedback and then giving them enough data to decide based upon that what they think would be a best option. That's kind of how I tend to play it in organizations, is sort of saying, we did the experiments already, we captured the feedback. Now here are 3 or 4, or 2, or maybe even 2 best ideas on how to move forward. We can talk about the pros and cons. For leadership team, executives, here's the options. You guys can choose which one you think is best. Here's the pros, here's the cons, here's the feedback. And then they have to decide the expert process behind that. Does that make sense, Michael?
Yeah, it does. The difficulty that we run into often is the fact that you need to get approval to run the experiments from the leadership team. And so when you go to them and say, we need to run some experiments, they say, okay, fine, run the experiments, but make sure everyone is successful. and you're not wasting any time.
Yeah, no, I feel, I feel you on that, because you're right. Because it's like, if we're gonna get a small budget, that's what we call them safe to fail experiments. But you're right. It's sort of saying like, hey, they're not all gonna work. So it's, yeah, it's tough.
And you know, it's the idea basically is to sell them on the fact that, okay, this is a complex problem. We need to figure some things out, and so what we do basically is we get approval for some figuring out time, and then during that they give us a block of time and money to figure things out, and during that then we run experiments. We don't go say we want to run these experiments. We just say we need some time to figure this out, and usually you can get approval for that.
Yeah, that makes total sense. It's a good way to. This is the challenge of me being an outside guy and you guys being inside guys, which is you know, it's I make a joke with companies all the time, is that as a consultant, you know, it's easy for me to kind of come in and say things, and it's different when you're on the inside. But I like that idea, Michael, of sort of saying like, hey, this is rather complex. We're going to figure out the information to make sense of this. We just need a block of time to figure things out, right? And then from that block of time, we then have maybe a small budget of resources to run some experiments, see what's going to work, and then go back and say, we ran multiple experiments. From the data, here's our trend of what works and what doesn't work. Here's our idea moving forward. But that again is, I mean, even on a sort of meta, like cynefin level, that's you as the decision maker trying to figure out in the complex zone, what's the best way to get your feedback through to the leadership team, right? So it's saying, I know that if I go to them on this, and it's also running small probes. So I think about, in a similar vein, is when I'm facilitating groups with face-to-face stuff, like I'll do multiple things. We'll do like hands-on things. We'll do discussion-based things. We'll do flip chart things. We'll do some team building things. And I'll throw multiple things at the group. I'm pulsing in the complex zone until I figure out what works best for them. And then I say, oh, this group wants more like flip chart discussion-based stuff. And I'll stop doing my hands-on things and kind of amplify the flip chart stuff and do more of those kind of pieces. So in real time in my head, I'm saying, when I enter a room, it's relatively complex. And then as I'm running the experiments, I want to figure out what's working best for this environment, what works best, and how do I kind of amplify those pieces. If that makes sense. And I see we're dropping tons of great links in the chat box, which is awesome. So thank you guys for all these things. And I'll send a bunch more. I'll also send a bunch more. So this is great. All right. So are there more questions or discussion points? I'm happy to hang out. So.
Sagar, you want to ask the question yourself or us to read it? So he's written that as a junior member or a consultant in an organization, we might not have the voice to drive the thinking of the organization to make use of this framework to make sense of a complex situation, unless an expert or a leader suggests it. What should a consultant do to nudge the decision maker towards this framework?
So the challenge of being a junior person in the organization, you want to try this out. What are some ideas? So what do you guys think? Any feedback on that piece? Like kind of how to, if you want to try this out, you don't have the political clout. What are some ways to put this forward?
Well, maybe you could try it with maybe not the leaders, but maybe a team on maybe a little, like a smaller scale, and get some practice with it and see how it goes. And then, you know, if you can show some little wins, maybe you can, that might help with convincing the higher level leaders, if you will, to give you the leeway to do that.
Yeah, thanks. Anybody else? What else?
Same, in the same vein, what we did, Ted and myself, another who took the training, when they showed how to get out of the complex zone, that you could be either a heretic or you could do like those kind of things, right? So we did almost the same thing to bring it to the organization. to get sort of a wider, like for example, we started doing not only external meetup, but internal meetups also. Change the behavior by doing small things.
One thing to consider is, is there a particular kind of methodology or something that your organization currently is kind of subscribed to? And I ask that because, in the mid-90s through, 2015, I was at Motorola. They were really big on Six Sigma. I had a hard time letting go of it because they invented it. And when we were first trying to get some, agile stuff done there and just try and sell it, first of all, we didn't use names or words like Scrum or Extreme anything. We called it a process improvement, which was, acceptable on the logo.
Yep.
And we tried to do some of those first experiments, literally kind of proving the effectiveness of, in a single team situation, an agile development team as a Six Sigma experiment, which is kind of tricky, but sometimes, if that's the currently accepted lingo and vocabulary and stuff, sometimes you have to start there with that vocabulary and those concepts to help move people, to what you're trying to get them explore. But what you're trying to do also has to be something that can somehow be revealed within the limits of the thing that you're having to use to do it. So.
Yeah, Brad, that's a good example. It's funny, so from Buffalo, like Motorola, it's funny. A lot of those guys are still around Buffalo, right? So they're not Moog and other companies, and so I run into them all the time at meetings. And but the example you use is sort of that almost internal sort of parallel process with the language. You're going to bring things to where it is a really strong tool that we see that you can do inside. And you don't have to be a senior person, right? You can sort of say, I have this new method or model. Can I almost cloak it in the existing with the sheep and wolf's clothing, right? So, or the wolf and sheep's clothing. You're sort of saying, hey, we are a Six Sigma environment, and then you kind of create a small way, and it seems like the same thing, but you're varying it just enough to create that perturbation on the edge. And they kind of go, hey, what are you guys doing over there? And because you're getting good results. And then you sort of say, hey, can I show you what we're doing? I want to show you. And then and you quietly let it kind of
I've seen the same thing done with Lean as well. In Six Sigma, you had to be careful because you couldn't just assume that DMAIC is the right model. Six Sigma has a few other alternatives there, and you got to make sure you do the analysis to find the right thing. But a lot of these, once they've grown into a major system, there's some commonality in how they say, hey, look, this is kind of your space or ranges of things that you're trying to apply this to. And so it can help introduce things that way and get some credibility. It's tricky.
Another example I'll use when I was a younger junior person in organizations too, is that a lot of times, like if I found a tool method that worked, I would find, 3 or 4 people who were either on my team or had similar ideas to me. I'd pull them in and we'd say, hey, we're going to develop this small system. I mean, now the fancy term is, we call it, a skunk work or something. Hey, I had this idea. We're going to try this slightly different process in the organization. We're going to test it out and see what happens. And if you have 3 or 4 tight folks with you in the process, you get it done. And then the one thing is, if you're a junior person, you start to figure out ways to kind of work out loud. So then you, without attacking the existing pedagogy of the organization, you you let folks know you're doing things a little different, and you kind of slightly show your work align with process, and that may or may not stick, but it's helpful to do that. I mean, and this is in many ways it's the same example I used on the Cynefin of the simple, the clear versus the chaos piece, right? So, I mean, I'll use Motorola and Kodak and those companies as an example, right? So, and I'm seeing it right now, manufacturing across a lot of sectors, right? Six Sigma, quality standards, the environment's the same, nothing's shifting. We can just Six Sigma this thing across, and suddenly your whole environment, China increases, Japan increases, manufacturing increases, the world shifts, and suddenly you fall off that cliff and you lose a huge share of your market because you weren't aware the environmental perturbations happened. So
yeah, well, I think you also touched on something there too. If if you can kind of figure out, what's the accepted thing your organization is doing, there's probably some assumptions that things are predicated on in there. And if you can kind of figure out the difference between that and, the kind of problem you're trying to solve, because that was a big thing with Six Sigma when you were going in the physical world to the virtual and the software world. It wasn't just there's more uncertainty. It's, stuff is in a different world here. There's physical, tangible, where, biological sciences apply and life sciences and physics. And then, there's the virtual stuff. It's more ruled by complexity and things like, the notion of economies of scale, which is what a lot of the Six Sigma stuff was based on, that I'm trying to produce the exact same set of outputs from the exact same set of inputs, over and over again, because I'm trying to mass produce. That's not what we're doing in software, and that's not what we're doing as things get more and more digital. So if you can kind of figure out what's shifting underneath that, may no longer be valid, what are those predicates, those assumptions, those axioms? In product family stuff, there's something called commonality and variability analysis, which is a lot of syllables for just, what we used to do on Sesame Street. Which one of these things is not like the other? How can you find the 7 differences in this picture?
And I think, in some ways, even with, this is why, with the cynefin framework, well, in my mind, it's a conceptual, it's a meta framework. It's also a way of kind of categorizing or understanding how you're going to approach things. So again, I know the sort of final point, and I'll kind of start the recording in like 2 minutes, but it's sort of saying we have these 5 domains. So you have things that are clear and obvious, but it's always thinking about the decision maker's standpoint. So with Michael's example, if I'm going to go to an executive team, I want to kind of put myself to sort of say, if the executive or the decision maker has to make a choice, what's their framework based upon the process? How do they frame this? Or if I'm a project team lead and I'm leading an agile team, I want to think that people in the room, how do they view the challenge? Because something that's complicated to Michael may be totally complex or chaotic to me, right? The lawyer example is a great one. So again, the example I used earlier. So my mom's house is in foreclosure. I didn't know what to do. I read the paperwork. I couldn't figure it out, but I knew somebody knew how to fix it. So I went to the lawyer. Lawyer said, no problem. Fixed it in like 5 minutes. So what was complex or chaos to me, to the lawyer was complicated, and she fixed it in a second. And so it's thinking, how is the person going to perceive the issue? Or even like Michael's example of meeting with the senior teams, right? If I've never done that before, to you, maybe relatively clear. Mike, you walk in, give them the 3 options, walk out, follow the procedure. But to me, maybe I've never experienced it before. So I go into complex and try to do multiple probes in real time to see what's working and capture feedback quickly in the process. So it's always thinking about it from the standpoint of the decision maker or the person that has to make the choice, as opposed to how you frame it, unless you're making the decision yourself.
That reminds me of the aspect of DevOps that's sometimes called infrastructure as code or configuration as code, where previously it lived in this one domain, but if you think about it the right way and start introducing this virtual stuff, then this one concept moves the problem that you're trying to solve from, one, what is it, not a quadrant, but a quintant from one portion of the cynefin diagram.
Yeah, well, you gotta be careful.
Other.
So the cynefin, the hardcore cynefin folks, like you mean called domains. They call it a quadrant.
Yeah, I've seen Snowden speak before, and he has almost as much contempt for the people who refer to it as quadrants when there's 5 of them as he does for safe. But he's got a special level of contempt for safe, and it's interesting if you can find a video of him kind of talking about how you use something like cynefin to think about the scaling agile problem, and the safe doesn't belong in the domain that a lot of people tend to put it in. It's very interesting. And
I think hey, let me just stop the recording really quick. So let me stay here. We can chat for another second. Let me just stop. So yeah.